but the encouragers to talk about the OER in India and teacher education, and we're going to go ahead and finish my I could do 5 minutes.
Okay then, well, thank you for hanging on in there until the last minute and coming on to this presentation, which is something I'm very passionate about. I'm a researcher with the OER Research Hub. You've heard a lot about us over the past couple of days. One strand of the work we're doing is with the use of OER in the developing world. And today I'm going to talk to you about the potential for OER to be used in the context of India's teacher education system. And I'll start by giving you a bit of context about Indian teacher education. This is a clip from an infographic. If you follow the link when the slides get published, you can see the whole thing. It's difficult to deny that India's education system has problems, both in the quality and the quantity of teaching provision, and this is evidenced in standards of school learning. The way that this is measured in India, one of the ways is the Annual Status of Education report. And in 2012, it noted an alarming degeneration in the standards of learning in rural Indian schools. And this representation here shows that for grade 2 textbooks, which, to give a bit of context, is age 6, by the time a primary school student, and that ranges through to age 11, reaches the end of their primary school, quite a large number still can't read a grade 2 textbook. So pupils are progressing through the grades without actually learning. And a key headline figure here is that there is a 1.33 million shortfall of teachers in India. Now, keeping with the theme of the education standards, I've thought about why this is actually happening. And here are a few reasons. The first part of this infographic says that there is a huge problem with absenteeism in Indian schools. Up to a third, when the Annual Status of Education report did its reporting, were found to be absent from class. One reason for this is that there's a pull from parents who want their children to be working at home, rather than being in school. The second part of this infographic shows that more than half the classes that were surveyed had students of mixed levels sitting together, so working in the same classes. And obviously there are problems there for teaching and learning. Every student has to compete with up to 41 other students in classrooms, so big classrooms. And 25% of students go to schools where they are not taught in their mother tongue. So quite a few things there stacking up to provide a context where there are real problems with standards of education in India. And a bit of math for you here. So an insufficient supply of teachers, 1.33 million shortfall. Limited capacity for teacher training. Disparities in pupil-teacher ratios, large numbers of unqualified teachers, inadequate continuing professional development. They all add up to inadequate access to education and poor standards of learning. So, just honing in a little bit here, one part of a report in 2013, the Times of India reported that over 99% of Bachelors of Education graduates failed to pass the Central Teacher Eligibility Test, and that's mandatory for becoming a teacher for classes 1 to 8 in any central government school. And quite a high percentage of those graduates were already elementary school teachers and had passed a 2-year diploma in teacher education. So there's a real sort of disparity in the standard of qualifications and subsequently in the skill of teachers. And what I'm going to be asking here is, are open educational resources the the answer. So, a bit of context about OER in India. There is a huge appetite for openness in India, especially within the Indian higher education system. And you may have heard recently about the launch of the National Repository for Open Educational Resources in India. And there are quite a lot of initiatives around in India. I've pulled out one of my favourites, Project Oscar. I've given the links on here so you can follow it up. It's a pretty big repository of CC licensed simulations and animations for teaching science and technology. And it's a pretty cool repository, really. Some of the appetite for openness in India is stimulated by the Indian government enthusiasm for OER. And in 2008, the Indian government's National Knowledge Commission called for a national e-content and curriculum initiative to stimulate the creation, adaptation and utilisation of OER by Indian institutions, in addition to leveraging globally produced OER. So, an explicit statement of commitment to OER by the government. Now, the substance of my work for the OER Research Hub in this area has focused on the TESS-India project. TESS-India stands for Teacher Education in School Sector India, and it's a UK Open University-led project. It's funded by the UK's Department for International Development. And I'll just say a little bit about what it does, what TESS-India does. Okay. They're creating OER for training both new and existing teachers. So, for the creation of OER, these OER will be both leadership development units and teaching development units. So, dealing with leadership teaching. They're going to be delivered in 7 states across India, some in the north and some in the south, and in 4 languages, including Hindi, which is the national language of this one in India. And they'll initially be delivered face-to-face, partly because of the context of delivery, which I'll talk about a little later. And then there'll be an online repository, in addition to CD and DVD formats and SD for mobile phone use and mobile device. And the aim of this project is to engage both school leaders in understanding effective management systems and school review, and also to engage teachers in taking on learner-centered, activity-based pedagogy. It's something that we may take for granted ourselves, but you may be asking now, you may be thinking, but there's a whole heap of OER out there for teacher education. We've heard a lot about it today, yesterday, the day before in the sessions. Why can't they just use what's already there? Maybe that would be simpler. Well, most of the existing teacher education OER are in the English language, for a start. Massive hurdle. And they're also designed for an audience outside of India. So a key focus of the TESS-India project, especially in the next few months, is localization of OER that have been created for use across the 7 states. And Tiffany Ivins studied localization of OER in Nepalese rural communities. And this is a quote from her. She says that localization unlocks the power of OER, a must and more local. And TESS-India is working with local writers to adapt not only the language, which seems to be the most obvious need for localization, but also pedagogy. The different states have different ways of teaching and learning. Geographical imagery. States in the north don't identify with imagery from the south. Cultural references. Lots of different types of content in order to make the resource pertinent to a local context. Now, I went over to India in May of this year for the OER Research Hub, and I spent quite a while visiting district institutes of education and training. From now on, I'm going to call these diets. Everybody does, and that'll save me a good 20 seconds. So, I was in Uttar Pradesh, which is in the north of India. I interviewed diet principals, teacher educators and trainee teachers in order to explore the potential impact of OER, to gauge attitudes towards their implementation in teacher education institutes. And there was a heck of a lot of interest in OER. And this quote from a wonderful diet principal, she said, teacher educators need exposure to good practices from here and abroad. But in most instances, they don't get it. So if they were connected and used the internet and OER, they'd have a direct link with the rest of the world. We tend to forget, we're so connected. Look at our Twitter stream, we're so connected. But these teachers have not got that link with the rest of the world. And with that comes connection with new ideas and new ways of teaching. So, the theory is that for India's teacher education system, OER can do the following things. It can contribute to ICT-focused professional development for teachers and for teacher educators. It can broaden the range of the curriculum. I suppose that's a fairly straightforward thing to imagine. It can allow teachers to make their lessons more engaging, especially for those hard-to-reach pupils, the ones whose parents want to keep them at home, to keep them in the classrooms instead. It also encourage teachers and teacher educators to reflect on their practices when they come into contact with different pedagogies from outside and different ways of teaching. And so to perhaps move a little from their habitual approach. And isn't there always a but? Whilst I was in India, I also started realising that things weren't so simple, and that there are a number of barriers to OER use in the Indian teacher education system. Some of them you may recognise from other contexts. They're far from unique, and some are more unique to India. So, the full potential of OER, as we've been discussing the past few days, is as adaptable learning materials. And that, in turn, is dependent on teachers and teacher educators having ICT skills and access to an internet connection and to ICT equipment. Now, the ICTs of the diets that I visited varied very, very widely. And, for example, one diet, this lady here, she is the principal of the diet. The only computer in the whole building was in her office. And she had sole access to it, had an internet connection, and she was just using it for email. And there was no other access. In addition to that, they had electricity for probably about a couple of hours a day on average. And so even if they had the equipment, they wouldn't have had the power to do it. And this is a quote from the principal. She said, we're very limited in the computers and resources we've got available. The faculty have very limited ICT capabilities too. Many have professional development needs for ICT training. She explained that her lecturers were really well qualified. Many of them had PhDs, but she didn't think many of them used the internet. So, it's not all a story of a lack of equipment, a lack of skills. Lucknow diets, depicted here, was the most well-equipped of the diets that I visited, and had internet-connected PCs in every room, data projectors in every room, and even a biometric scanning system that I'm shown here for the entry to the college. But even here, the potential for OER use isn't as straightforward as it might seem. And the teacher educators still had limited skills. And one of them told me that she finds it difficult to train the trainee teachers, many of those of whom have more ICT skills than she has. And she said, they expect me to be as good as them because I'm the lecturer, but I have nothing new that I can give them. So there's a lack of skills development here. And this really highlights the fact that any introduction of open educational resources needs to be accompanied by ICT skills training. And the principal of the diet said there's a great need for CPD in using OER. Almost half the teacher educators here, and remember, this is a really well-equipped diet, they're not using email, despite persuasion. Basic capacity building is highly required, and that will allow the teachers to use and evaluate OER according to their needs, and to get a sense of ownership. So, a lack of ICT skills problem. Staying here with the well-equipped Lucknow diet, here's a picture of a panel discussion that I held with the teachers who were absolutely fascinated with how the rest of the world does teacher education. A further barrier to the use of OER is change of attitude. And again, the principal said to me, some of the teachers have the ICT skills, but they don't use the professional development. They need to look beyond Facebook and social networking. They need to think about using ICT skills for work before we can realise the potential of OER here and elsewhere. So barriers are stacking up. Now, I said at the beginning of the presentation that some of the barriers may be unique to India and some more general. Something that emerged that I hadn't actually thought about before I visited India and started talking to people is a resistance to openness in a deeply hierarchical society, a caste-based system. And I've put up here Joanna Wild's three-step model of educators' engagement with OER. I know that's relevant. And in her model, low engagement involves educators using and sharing resources with no adaptation. Medium engagement involves them integrating OER into core teaching materials and tweaking them to meet their own needs. And high engagement involves producing and sharing OER and becoming an advocate. And going beyond that low engagement with OER is crucial for their full potential to be realised. And I've got a quote here from one of the TESS-India team. We were discussing this issue. And he said that the true openness associated with OER adaptation may not align well with India's hierarchical caste-based culture, because there were rigid notions about who owns and should own the knowledge. There's a great respect for experts. If a professor has created a teaching resource, why would I adapt it? So there's a resistance to adaptation, a resistance to ownership. And he said, this guy from TESS-India said that the adaptation possibilities offered by OER bring the pedagogical approach to life, but it remains to be seen whether there will be buy-in from all levels of education system. Now, I started the presentation by talking about declining standards of learning, problems in teacher education standards, but maybe that's part of the problem, because there's a bit of a danger of there being a self-perpetuating deficit view of India's teachers. There are some fabulous teachers out there. I saw some amazing things. And I put this photo up as just one example of the incredible work that's being done by teachers without any internet, without any computers, in making teaching and learning resources. And it really took me back to some of my own teaching experience. And many of the people that I interviewed did suggest that a lack of teacher motivation could be a problem for the adoption of OER. And so it's arguable that, in fact, the public attacks on teachers could be a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And my discussions with the teachers and teacher educators highlighted the fact that there's a need to show the teachers that they're valued and to give them autonomy over their professional development and allow them to be inspired by each other, and that will help to facilitate the adoption of OER. So, how could this be done? The barriers I've mentioned so far could be seen to paint quite a pessimistic picture of the potential for OER adoption in India. But there is some evidence from diverse examples worldwide that show that a communities of practice approach could be used to ensure that OER have maximum impact within the teacher education system, and that those barriers that I've just mentioned are minimised. And I spoke to Sanjay Mishra, and he's the director of the Commonwealth Educational Media Centre for Asia. And he talked about communities of practice. He said that building a culture of sharing is a key challenge for India. Sharing is not embedded in Indian society, and OER is more likely to work if we develop communities of practice, especially amongst teacher educators and the diets. So, just wanted to quickly go through a couple of examples. I've got here a couple of Facebook groups I found where teacher educators and training teachers are already getting together on Facebook to support each other as a community of practice. In Bangalore in southern India, there's an organisation, it's an NGO called IT for Change, and they have 2 OER projects built on a communities of practice model, which I think could show a way forward. One was Subject Teacher Forum, it's piloted in 2011-2012. 800 plus high schools were covered, and it covered 14 districts of Karnataka in southern India. And operated on an enhanced cascade model, where state-level workshops developed 240 maths and science and social science high school teachers as resource persons. And then those resource persons subsequently trained 2,000 teachers in 800 schools. And they used the DIET ICT labs. And these workshops covered ICT skills, the use of public educational software, and discussions about policy and pedagogy. Now, the community of practice approach comes in because this was complemented by mailing groups and a web portal, I've given a link here, through which the teachers discussed their disciplines and created and shared OER together, so supporting each other. And this project is now being extended to cover additional disciplines in schools. Second project is the Teachers Communities of Learning project, and that covered a smaller number of schools. There's 20 schools in all, but it covered all of the teachers in those schools. And similarly, they have a web portal. They're creating and sharing OER together, discussing pedagogy, discussing events, and this is being supplemented by face-to-face workshops. And what's my take-home message then? So, I believe, the teacher educators I talked to believe, TESS-India believe, that OER can help in training new and existing teachers and teacher educators in India to help make up for that 1.33 million shortfall in teacher provision in India. But there's need for ICT equipment, ICT skills development, a change of attitude to ICT use for work purposes, resources localised in language and content. I was at a presentation in Paris a couple of weeks ago, and Abel Kane from UNESCO talked about the fact that 99% of the OER in the world are in the English language, and yet perhaps the greatest need is in the developed world. So localization is important, and also the development of a communities of practice approach that gives teachers autonomy and access to peer support and reputation management. TESS-India is going to be adopting this approach through their own web portal, whereby teachers will rate the resources that are found there, and they'll have a reputation management system that will allow them to comment on each other's resources, comment on the resources that are already there, and it's hoped that this will incentivize the production sharing of OER in India. AK from UNESCO also told me that he's in discussions with the Indian government about ways the government can incentivize the use of OER amongst teachers and teacher educators. So, watch this space in terms of the OER Research Hub, in terms of TESS-India, and I'm really happy to take any questions you have on this. Thank you. Thank you for hanging on in there at the end of the day.
I'm afraid we are out of time, so if you'd like to answer questions in the hallway, you're welcome to do that. We'll set up the last presenter.
Yep.